Hi all, Jack Existential here with a new video. This subject today is going to be about cosmism, the old Soviet avant-garde cult for a imagined space age, or if I'm not mistaken, that's essentially what it is, or what it was. It's faded into obscurity, but uh, it is worth doing a video on because it did have some notoriety in Soviet culture, and especially the term Soviet supreme culture. And a lot of the thinkers of cosmism proposed extremely radical ideas, even for the Soviet elites. And their belief was that to achieve absolute socialism and abolish private property in a society, we would need to become immortal. We could do that through one of several ways, at least how they proposed at the time. Number one was through a blood transfusion with everybody, a sort of communal blood transfusion, that we become literal uh, blood brothers and comrades in a totally egalitarian society. Now, this has roots in Russian Orthodoxy, but also in the occult as well. Now, it was started by a man named Nikolai Fyodorov, and he passed away in December 28th of 1903. But in life, as it says, he was celebrated by Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and by a devoted group of disciples, one of whom is credited with winning the space race for the Soviet Union. Okay, now this is the backstory on cosmism before we actually get into what it actually is and what they defined it as. So, Fyodorov's property came by religious choice rather than material necessity. Um, yeah, so he chose to live in abject poverty. He was the illegitimate child of Prince Pavel Gagarin and spent his early childhood on the family's country estate until the sudden death of both his father and grandfather, Prince Ivan Gagarin, while Fyodorov's family had no connection to the first cosmonaut, Anastasia Gacheva of the Fyodorov Museum Library in Moscow, says, there is an important symbolic coincidence between the Gagarin who foresaw spaceflight in a philosophical way and the Yuri Gagarin who became the world's first cosmonaut, the world's first man in space. So that is pretty significant, at least in the era of Soviet propaganda during the space race. You know, this was foretold by a Gagarin, and we have a man named Gagarin who was the first to enter the void of space. So, Fyodorov lived an ascetic lifestyle. He ate only bread, drank tea and water, but he inhabited an exhilarating intellectual milieu. Sorry. Okay, so he became a librarian at the age of 40, and this was no library where he worked. He was librarian at the Rumyantsev museum opposite the Kremlin. in the heart of Moscow. He hosted an informal intellectual salon, and his devotees referred to him as the Socrates of Moscow. Dostoevsky was in awe of, quote, this great thinker. His ideas have enthralled me. When I read him and understand what they mean, I feel as if they are completely part of me, that they are close to my heart, that they could be mine, end quote. The novelist spent hours discussing Fyodorov's theories with the philosopher Vladimir Solovyov, who regarded Fyodorov as a Christ-like figure, while Tolstoy described Fyodorov's worldview in a letter to a friend, saying, he has devised a plan for a common task for humanity, the aim of which is the bodily resurrection of all humans. First, it is not as crazy as it sounds. Don't worry, I do not and never have shared his views, but I have understood them enough to feel capable of defending them against any other beliefs of a similar material nature. Secondly, and most importantly, because of these beliefs, he leads the purest Christian life. He is 60, a pauper, sorry. It's a word I need to work on. He gives away all he has, is always cheerful and meek. So, Tolstoy and Fyodorov shared a similar creed driven by a fierce resistance to war. Fyodorov lamented that while the poor remained at the mercy of droughts and floods, universities had become nothing more than, quote, the backyards of factories and army barracks, that is, serving industrialism and militarism. Both men wished to divert war's destructive energies into ecological renewal. Quote, in parentheses, a civilian that exploits but does not restore cannot have any other result than the approach of its own end, wrote Fyodorov, end quote. While like Tolstoy, he opposed the idea of books as private property when his few written works were compiled for publication posthumously. They were accompanied with sticker stating, quote, not for sale. So, yeah. So, yeah. Fyodorov's Fyodorov's philosophy stemmed from the defining moment of his life, the deaths of his father and his father's father, and his family's subsequent departure from their rural idyll. All of his intellectual endeavors can be understood as an attempt to repair the rupture, to restore to restore and recapture a lost Eden. His philosophy of the common task, which was his book, um, published in the early 20th century, it envisages a world in which each generation will resurrect its dead ancestors. We should give birth to fathers, he wrote. So there is definitely the Christian uh, source of that idea in Christ's harrowing of hell and the prophesized second resurrection at the end of the book of Revelation. So in the Gospels, Jesus supposedly goes to hell, and well, he goes to hell within the 3 days. He uh, is essentially bodily dead, and he releases all of the souls that came before humanity so that they could bear witness to him and he could defeat the devil, at least in that moment, and let the souls ascend to heaven. Um, so Fyodorov says we should give birth to fathers, but this will soon overpopulate the world. So it is imperative that we reach into space to settle on new stars where the resurrected can live harmoniously. Yet the further we venture, the more we need to revive. Quote, all matter is the dust of ancestors, end quote. So the only solution is radical life extension, the death of death itself. And now, despite the focus on lost ancestors, Fyodorov's legacy was to inspire new generations. His most brilliant protege, Konstantin. Okay, bear with me here. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, yeah, was also defined by a traumatic childhood event. At the age of 10, Tsiolkovsky caught scarlet fever and became almost completely deaf. Schools barred him from entry. So for 3 years, he studied at the Rumiantsev under Fyodorov's guidance. So essentially, he studied in the library and under Fyodorov's little club. And there he became fascinated with the colonization of space, and which he came to believe would liberate humankind and lead to the perfection of other species. Okay, so, and a quote here, I suppose, from Sol Tsiolkovsky. That might more accurately reflect the pronunciation. Pardon me. He says, although adverse to Fyodorov's Orthodox Christianity, senior Soviets admired his critique of consumerism. Okay, maybe that quote was not from Tsiolkovsky. Uh, maybe that was from somebody else, though. Could have been from him. It doesn't say who said that. But a recluse by nature, uh, Tsiolkovsky spent most of his life in a remote log cabin where he devoted himself to, quote, each atom's eternal, well-being. His most important work, Exploration of Outer Space by Means of Rocket Devices, published in 1903, pioneered astronautic theory, proving for the first time that spaceflight could be propelled by boosters. He sketched designs for rockets with steering thrusters for space stations and airlocks for exiting into the vacuum of space, and for closed cycle biological systems to provide food and oxygen for space colonies. All of which would later inspire Soviet engineers. So the Soviet Union did have a sort of indigenous rocket theory. Mankind would not remain on Earth forever. Mankind will not remain forever on Earth, he predicted. The pursuit of light and space will lead him to penetrate the bounds of the atmosphere, at first timidly, then conquering the whole solar system. So, this was their theory on achieving absolute socialism. That we abolish. Why would we need private property when we can, when our limits have pushed into the other planets, and we can live in perfectly comfortable in the vacuum of space, and you know, immortality abolishes the need for food and sustenance. So Fyodorov's acolytes, including Tsiolkovsky and Solovyov, sorry, I might have mispronounced his name previously, are associated with an intellectual movement called Cosmism, which made a significant impact in philosophy, theology, the sciences, and the visual arts in both pre revolutionary Russia and the Soviet period. Although adverse to Fyodorov's Orthodox Christianity, senior Soviets admired his critique of consumerism, the quote, toys that divert our attention and imagination, and his emphasis on collective salvation, parentheses, quote, not for oneself and not for others, but with everyone and for everyone, wrote Fyodorov, end quote. uh, so Fyodorov was a Orthodox believer, although he was inspiring the secularization of resurrection and immortality. Before then, it was completely within the bounds of theology. So now uh, we're in a period here where the lines between science, theology, and I guess a hint of the arts is being completely blurred by these theorists, because you need a hint of the arts to explain their sort of um, flavor of science and theology, that all of this can be applied into the socialist himself, and that the abolishment of private property can only be accomplished through this way. So the author of this article goes on to explain about the the movement during the Russian Civil War that included a party within the Soviet Party, the biocosmist immortalists, and the anarchist universalists. In this time, split, and they denounced death as logically absurd, ethically impermissible, and aesthetically ugly. So there is the hint of the arts within um, this sort of secularized theology. The old Soviet avant-garde proclaimed death as aesthetically ugly and ethically impermissible. But how they would achieve their theory was a bit contradictory to this sort of aesthetic belief, at least within one of the thinkers in this group, a very important thinker. But they advocated the galactic liberation from statehood, called for the urgent establishment of cosmic communication, and made by two, quote, basic demands: freedom of movement in interplanetary space and the right to live forever. So, yeah, the author of the 1921 Biocosmist Manifesto. So, uh, cosmism was the precursor to biocosmism, and biocosmism applies the principles of immortal space communion to the human body. So, and well, eventually in this theory was that humanity would transcend its its own biology and ascend into pure light. We'd become so advanced thanks to this socialism of the collective self in space, and through means of these technological and artistic theories at the time. Um, Fyodorov, in defining two types of death, said bodily decomposition and spiritual death. Okay, interesting. So, what he called, quote, death in life, uh, yeah, that would have been how he described spiritual death. You lose the power of belief. You lose the force of belief in your life, and that is one way to die while you're still alive, according to this Orthodox Christian giant at the time. Not quite giant, I should say. He had his following, but he was considered to be a giant by Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. That's kind of a giant enough in history, although he's not really talked about, this man, Fyodorov, as much as at least he should be, at least. Um, didn't mean to use my words redundantly there, but um, he identified with this loss of one's distinctive personality and identity, while Sviatogor applied it to capitalism, arguing that death lies in, quote, monstrous private ownership. Okay. So there's different theories about what is truly the most abhorrent death, or the most abhorrent form of death that we know of in society, which cannot be eliminated in a moral world where dying buys you a private piece of time. Sviatogor also adopted Fyodorov's idea of transforming the planet into a giant Earth ship, so that instead of continuing as idle passengers around the sun's orbit, we become, quote, the crew of our celestial craft, end quote. For cosmists, the point is not to understand nature, but to change it. So, someone says here, Sergei Korolev, the chief designer of Sputnik 1 and Gagarin's rocket Vostok 1, had been profoundly influenced by Tsiolkovsky. So in 1922, the founder of the Petrograd chapter of Biocosmists, Alexander Yaroslavsky, wrote a 14-page poem in praise of anabiosts. I guess anabiost would be, sorry, anabiosis. I guess the the deforming of of the bodily state into something beyond. The process of cryonic suspension, used 2 years later to preserve Lenin's body, although they used cryonic suspension, although Lenin was dead. He was embalmed. They embalmed him, meaning they only really slowed the decay of the body, because they revered Lenin's body so much that somehow they felt a part of him was still immortal, even as he was slowly decaying, but kept in stasis. While refrigeration proved unsuccessful, exactly, his corpse was embalmed. So that was before they embalmed him. I guess they wanted to prove that they could somehow make the idea of Lenin, at the very least, physically immortal. And that wasn't quite successful the first time, so the second time there was just embalmed in chemicals. So during the early years of the Soviet Union, Lenin had tolerated the Cosmists, but they were soon circumcised by his successor Stalin, who was hostile to the religious roots of their scientific outlook, and they had been publicly supportive of his rival Trotsky. The vast majority of Cosmists were jailed or sent to labor camps, like Sviatogor, who disappeared in Siberia, and all the works were suppressed. Okay, so following Stalin's death, Soviets turned again to space just in time to counter American efforts to launch satellites into orbit. So, Korolev, the chief designer for the aforementioned Sputnik 1, and the cosmonaut Gagarin's own rocket, Vostok number 1, had been profoundly influenced by Tsiolkovsky. And after their meeting, young Korolev at the time wrote, quote, have I left his house with just one thought, to build rockets and fly in them. From now on, I have one goal in life, to get to the stars. Korolev oversaw the design and construction of Sputnik 1. In just 1 month, it was launched on October 4th, 1957, the same year in which he published The Practical Significance of Konstantin Tsiolkovsky's Proposals in the Field of Rocketry. Um, yeah, so this is goes on to explain the post-Soviet theories of cosmism. Um, oops. Yeah. So it's no longer the current idea of cosmism right today is no longer about establishing uh, a sort of pseudoscience socialism or a theological socialism. Um, it is mostly just about, is something like that theoretically still possible? Um, Nonetheless, apparently, a portrait of Fyodorov sits alongside one of Arthur C. Clarke in the Church of Perpetual Life in Hollywood, Florida. That's interesting. Looks like we'll have to explore that in another video. Now, numerous American futurist thinkers acknowledge their debt to Fyodorov. Um, yes, this idea of cosmism does give eventually sort of proverbially give birth to the transhumanist movement, which itself is it's still in the realm of pseudoscience, although it has its root in theology, just like cosmism. So, the origins of cosmism in Russian Orthodoxy, and this explains why it's so hard to pinpoint exactly when this sort of scientific theology was floating around, because the idea of resurrection is nothing new, and its ties go deep into Russian Orthodoxy, thereby going deep into early Christianity. Um, Now, Catholicism evinced a predominantly historical orientation in directing the fates of the world. Orthodoxy was far more concerned with the cosmic and mystical dimensions. The quote, theosis or deification of a creature, end quote, a foremost aspiration of Eastern Christianity, presupposes the transfiguration not only in human flesh, but also of the entire substance of the universe and all living things. This tendency may be explained by the duality of Russian Orthodoxy, which bought a considerable pagan inheritance into its Christian foundation. In many cases, its believers worshipped forces of nature under the names of Christian saints. Via this, quote, dual faith or double belief, devoevry, I guess that's the Russian word, Christian communities consciously or unconsciously sorry, um, preserved pagan beliefs and or rituals, in effect adhering to the syncretic religion. Now, at its most primal, being conscious of a orientation in the universe has its roots in ancient Siberian shamanism, the earliest possible form of human religion that we can trace back to. And naturally, whenever a whole regional race is adopting a popular religion in the world, they are going to obviously perceive it as a synthesis. Well, they'd have to make it a synthesis with their own perception of the world around them, or at least within their mythology. Because many of these ideas of saints were not indigenous to the Jews. Um, it was absolutely a pagan idea based in the sort of hero worship of demigods, of magicians, mages, or uh, sort of mythological superhumans or magical superhumans. And historically, it says here, Russia functioned as a vast agrarian economy, and Russian Christianity accommodated the uh, preconceptions of the peasantry, whose imagination was oriented towards cyclical processes in nature, opposed to the linear historical dimension of a more urbanist Western civilization. So, yeah. So, I guess, according to this, one theory of cosmism in the Russian Orthodox canon was in the Deep Book or Dove Book, the Gulbinaya Kniga, yeah. Uh, so that's essentially a collection of spiritual verses, sometime around the 15th or 16th century. Yeah, it's about popular Christian beliefs at the time, mixed into folk songs and a sort of indigenous Russian astrology with anthropomorphic elements. So a kind of uh, personification of these eternal forces. So, according to the Deep or Dove book, uh, human thoughts derive from the heavenly clouds and bodies from the moist earth, with numerous other parallels drawn between the life of humankind and the workings of the universe, anticipating the basic um, presupposition of contemporary cosmism that human beings and the cosmos are symbiotically joined. Now, um, yeah, cosmism for a period in the 70s and 80s was was sort of floating around in the new areas of environmentalism, but it was still kind of fizzled out of popular thought because it's too pseudoscientific. You can't really give substance to metaphysics by definition. Metaphysics are the beyond existence, the kind of indescribable force that requires art to at least be visualized. And Christians to this day still believe that metaphysics has its merits, should be studied, should be taken as seriously as um, hard physics or chemistry, and biology for that matter. The problem is that um, when you get into the theories that this cosmism uh, belief, I should probably call it a mystery cult almost, because it was only ever based in theory. It only amounted to theory, and it was based heavily in Hegelian dialectics, of which apparently Fyodorov and his group were um, extremely interested in Hegel's idea of the cosmic order. And I would have no doubt that they believed Hegel's cosmic order only needed to be proven to be true, meaning that there is a fixed order in the cosmos that has to exist because human history has amounted to that theory, and that theory needs to exist according to uh, the dialectical theory of history and human thought. So we could go on forever talking about cosmism, and we're already almost at 40 minutes now. So uh, who knows? In the future, we might need to do another video on cosmism. Hopefully, not as long, but to that end, I'll say thank you for watching, and if possible, comment below and give any video suggestions that you might think would work well on this channel. So, take care.